Good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us. This is a very exciting event. We're very pleased to have everybody here. It's been a long time coming. Personally, I'm just very excited to be able to do this. My name is Abe Denmark. I'm the director of the Asia program at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. I also am a senior fellow in the Kissinger Institute on China and the United States, run by Robert Daly. And together we've been co-organizing, co-leading the Wilson China Fellowship with the very helpful and generous support of the Carnegie Corporation of New York. Just a few notes before we get started. This is the opening keynote session. We'll be listening to a keynote address from Ambassador Stapleton Roy. We're very pleased with our class, first class of scholars. Personally, I'm very proud of this class and the research that they've developed that we'll be hearing about over the next 2 days. I'll just mention that 2 of our China fellows are not going to be participating, Julian Gewurtz and Rush Dashi, and that is because they have been brought into the Biden administration, both working in the White House at the National Security Council, which I see as a victory for our China Fellowship. Even though it's we lose them today, I think we gain a lot of experience for the country, and I'm proud that our fellowship has been has had such important people involved in this and has put together such great research. To give opening welcome remarks from the Wilson Center is our vice president and my boss, Dr. Robert Litwak. Rob, I'll turn things over to you.
Thank you, Abe, and welcome to the virtual Wilson Center. Over today and tomorrow, you're going to hear presentations from our first class of Wilson China Fellows. The Wilson Center's Asia program, headed by Abe, in conjunction with the Kissinger Institute on China and the United States, directed by Robert Daly, operates the Wilson China Fellowship in support of policy-oriented academics with specialization in political, social, economic, security, or historical issues related to China. And the fellowships were made possible with the generous support of the Carnegie Corporation of New York. The founder and architect of the Wilson Center was the late Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan, whose career bridged between academia and public service. His abiding interest was on the relationship between ideas and public policy. His motivating belief, and I'm paraphrasing, was how you think about the world affects how you act in the world. In keeping with that, the Wilson Center's mission is to support policy-relevant scholarship, which we do through our fellowships and our programs, which sponsor a host of activities such as this conference, whose aim is to inform the public policy debate. The importance of the relationship between ideas and public policy cannot be overstated, because we know as Americans that an inadequate conceptualization of a foreign policy problem at the outset can have catastrophic downstream consequences. And that points to the urgent need to have a stronger policy conversation on U.S. China relations and the rise of China. This first cohort of fellows is contributing to that conversation in Washington with academically informed policy arguments. The topics range across the key issues that will shape this critical bilateral relationship in the coming years. I'm impressed by the incredible quality of the research that's been developed during this difficult time when research trips are not possible, as well as the diversity of this class. It is my pleasure to now pass the Zoom, as it were, to Steve Del Rosso, Director of the International Peace and Security Program of the Carnegie Corporation. It was Steve who conceived of this project 2 years ago, and over the years has done so much in the international relations field to promote policy-relevant scholarship and thereby bridge the gap between academia and public policy. Steve, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Rob, for those very generous words. Also, thanks to Abe and to Robert and the rest of the Woodrow Wilson staff. Very pleased to have been asked to say a few words before the conference begins formally. As mentioned, I direct the International Peace and Security Program at the Carnegie Corporation of New York, which is the grant-making institution founded by the great industrialist and philanthropist Andrew Carnegie in 1911, and is dedicated to the deceptively simple but weighty goal of the advancement and diffusion of knowledge and understanding. And just to be clear, since it is understandably comes up a lot, we're not to be confused with the esteemed Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, with whom we share the same grandfather, but are administratively separate and also pronounce our name differently, although only one of us does it correctly. Andrew Carnegie stood barely 5 feet tall, but he was a giant of a man. He was the son of an intermittently employed factory worker. Andrew immigrated with his family from Scotland as a boy in the mid-19th century. He was a lifelong autodidact who in his adult life could quote from the works of the greatest thinkers. He believed deeply in the power of ideas, which resonates with what Rob just said. This is one reason Andrew Carnegie built over 2,500 libraries in the US and abroad. Chief among those ideas was that war should be abolished, which he vividly described as the foulest fiend ever vomited from the mouth of hell. I apologize to anyone who's just finishing their breakfast. Although China factored, I say that the program I direct deals with some of the most pressing issues on the peace and security agenda, from nuclear security to peace building in Africa to relations with Russia, Iran, North Korea, and yes, China, where we are currently the largest private foundation funder in this area. Building on Andrew Carnegie's legacy, the Carnegie Corporation has, over its 110-year history, been a champion of the academy. Not only did Andrew Carnegie establish what is today TIA-CREF to ensure retirement benefits for faculty members, but the corporation has supported the research of thousands of academics in many fields and disciplines. In terms of the International Peace and Security Program, as my colleagues have heard me say too many times, I believe that good policy is informed by good ideas, and good ideas are not formed in a vacuum. We look to the academy as a major source of those ideas, while recognizing that the path from idea to policy is often long and nonlinear. Regarding Carnegie Corporation's involvement in China, it reaches back to 1913, when it made a grant of $200,000, which is equivalent to about 5 million in today's dollars, to what became known as the Chinese Educational Commission, headquartered in Hartford, Connecticut, to support Chinese students studying at U.S. colleges and universities. So although China has factored into Carnegie Corporation programming various ways over subsequent decades, it has really been only since the mid-noughts that the International Peace and Security Program has focused on China in earnest. During a trip I made to China in 2005, I met a wide range of experts, officials who had benefited from Carnegie Corporation funded programs at various institutions. Chinese experts, policy officials had also by that time been involved in our Track 2 dialogues on North Korea. Now, building on this base with the board and senior leadership approval, our initial efforts involved major support to what became the Carnegie Endowment's Tsinghua Center for Global Policy. About 8 years ago, after commissioning a needs assessment of China studies programs at U.S. universities and think tanks, and convening a group of experts to discuss those findings, the program sought out to address some key identified needs. They were, number one, nurturing a new generation of American experts on China, capable of someday replacing the senior ranks in the field who are nearing the end of their careers. Two, supporting empirically based, analytically rigorous, policy-relevant research to better understand and assess China-related developments. And third, promoting dialogues involving experts and officials from China on a range of issues, from regional security to the global economy. I should add that we've just commissioned another needs assessment of China studies in the US and hope to be able to follow up on some of those insights, since obviously so much has changed since the original study was conducted. I won't go into the many China-related projects we've supported that include some of the most well-known China programs at U.S. universities and think tanks. All our grants, by the way, can be found on our website, www.carnegie.org. But I did want to mention two initiatives that the corporation supports that directly addresses this effort to try to nurture this new generation of academic experts on China. One, administered by the National Bureau of Asian Research, provides an additional year of support to American would-be China hands in political science to refine their Mandarin language skills, who might otherwise be discouraged from pursuing this specialization because, among other reasons, of the already onerous demands of quantitative and formal modeling requirements in this field, particularly for PhD students. The other, of course, is the China Fellowship Program administered by our hosts today, the Wilson Center, whose beneficiaries comprise much of the audience today. The fellowships are aimed at expanding the range of current scholarship on China with particular interest in projects that, quote, transcend narrow specialties and methodological boundaries and that focus on topics that are understudied, unconventional, unique, emerging, or new within the academic and policy discussions, and importantly, have relevance to public policy. Now, we at the Carnegie Corporation take no narrow ideological or political stance in its support, but rather in the spirit of our founder, we're particularly interested in non-hawkish but outwardly engaged foreign policy ideas to ensure greater balance and debate and spur research and discussion in that direction. At the start of a new presidential administration, where relations between the US and China have reached a new level of tension and potential danger, where the only bipartisan agreement on foreign policy seems to be the need to get tough on China, now endorsed by large segments of the corporate sector, the need for deeply informed and nuanced understanding about this rising power seems more important than ever. We can take heart that some figures on President Biden's team are alums of the programs we've supported. Abe has mentioned two of them. As Henry Kissinger famously said, high office teaches decision-making, not substance. It consumes intellectual capital. It does not create it. Most high officials leave office with the perceptions and insights with which they entered, end quote. Well, while there's no guarantee that the intellectual capital that we help these new officials to amass while out of government will be expended wisely or expended at all, it is on the whole a good thing that they are steeped in knowledge and understanding, which also, to harken back to Andrew Carnegie, they will hopefully advance and diffuse in constructive ways. Thank you. I look forward to the discussion today and particularly the remarks of Ambassador Roy. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Stephen. Thank you, Rob, for getting us started. We'll turn things over to Ambassador Stapleton Roy, a longtime fixture in American China policy going back decades, served as ambassador in many countries throughout the Asia Pacific, and one of our top mentors in the Asia program. We will be doing if we have time, we will be doing a Q&A session with Ambassador Roy after his remarks. If you'd like to submit questions for him, you can do so in two ways. You can email asia@wilsoncenter.org, or you can tweet @AsiaProgram. So with that, I'll turn things over to Ambassador Stapleton Roy.
Thank you, Abe. Good morning. Over the next 2 days, as Rob mentioned, a distinguished group of Wilson Center Fellows will present their findings and recommendations on a range of foreign policy issues involving the rise of China and the outlook for U.S. China relations. Given the quality of these fellows, I am looking forward to a fascinating and stimulating 2 days. My role is more modest, which is simply to offer some thoughts that might be useful to bear in mind during our discussions. I was privileged to serve as an American Foreign Service officer for 45 years, beginning in 1956, when the United States was still adjusting to its status as a major global power. for the final 35 years of the Cold War, from 1956 until 1991, the period when I was in the Foreign Service, U.S. military capabilities were balanced by those of the Soviet Union, a global superpower that opposed the United States in our wars in Korea and Vietnam, brought us to the brink of nuclear war in 1962, when it tried to introduce nuclear missiles into Cuba, and claimed the leadership role in an ideological movement that dominated the heartland of Eurasia and had gained footholds in the Middle East, Africa, and the Western Hemisphere. With the unraveling of the Soviet Union in 1991, the United States emerged as the sole global superpower, a position that we had not sought and which was inherently inconsistent with our most fundamental political principle, which is that concentrated power is dangerous and must be checked and balanced. Most of us associate this concept with Lord Acton's admonition that power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. But it is interesting that George Washington actually addressed this very issue in his farewell address, in which he noted that the spirit of encroachment tends to consolidate the powers of all the departments into one, and thus to create, whatever the form of government, a real despotism. A just estimate of that love of power and proneness to abuse it, which predominates in the human heart, is sufficient to satisfy us of the truth of this position. The necessity of reciprocal checks in the exercise of political power by dividing and distributing it into different depositaries and constituting each the guardian of the public weal against invasions by the others, has been evinced by experiments ancient and modern, some of them in our country and under our own eyes. To preserve them must be as necessary as to institute them. This is a fascinating statement. The concept that the love of power and the proneness to abuse it was in the minds of our founding fathers is relevant today, and it's relevant in foreign policy. Curiously, Americans reveled in being the sole superpower, convinced that we would use our power not simply to advance US interests, but also to benefit mankind. 20 years, 30 years later, we have a better understanding of how easy it is to abuse unchecked power. From this rather narrow standpoint, the rise of China is a good thing, as is the transition to a multipolar world. But rather than welcoming this development, we are becoming increasingly concerned that China is gaining the capability to check and balance our power in ways that are damaging US interests and those of our allies, especially in East Asia. Indeed, this is one of the themes that we will be addressing over the next 2 days. Clearly, the foreign policy and security challenges facing the new Biden administration requires its undivided attention. But it is distracted by the most troubled US presidential transition in over 100 years. Nevertheless, our newspapers and journals are filled with essays offering advice on what we should be doing. As usual, the quality of this advice ranges from very good to horrid. Unsurprisingly, China occupies a central position in the policy recommendations that are being put forward. Following are some scattered thoughts that arose in my mind on reading these essays. First, we think about change in China in much too short a time frame. This is what I call the mistake of proving that grass does not grow. This is easy to do. Simply take a friend and sit together in your garden for several hours, At the end of this period, if you examine the grass, you will find there is no discernible change. But you will be wrong, of course. Grass does grow. If you wait a week to examine the change, you can easily identify it. George Kennan wrote his famous long telegram in February 1946. In it, he predicted that the Soviet Union would eventually collapse because of its own internal contradictions. He did not advocate trying to change Moscow's domestic system, recognizing that such an effort would be both dangerous and ineffective. Instead, he recommended that Soviet military expansion be contained, and this became the basis for the U.S. Cold War policy toward the Soviet Union. 45 years later, in 1991, the Soviet Union did indeed collapse, proving the accuracy of the Kennan prediction. But for nearly half a century, he had seemed to be wrong. Soviet communism lasted in Russia for 74 years, from 1917 until 1991. Most observers were surprised by the speed with which an apparently stable Moscow regime encountered a domestic crisis that led to its disintegration because of internal contradictions. In the case of China, the US policy of engagement has been discredited by knowledgeable foreign policy specialists who claim engagement was based on wholly unrealistic expectations that it would produce positive change in China. There is no question that engagement did facilitate Deng Xiaoping's reform and openness policies that produced several decades of rapid economic development in China, resulting in the globalization of its economy, and embedded hundreds of thousands of Western educated young Chinese in governing and educational institutions throughout the country. These developments did indeed make China a far more challenging rival to the United States. But they also were instrumental in modernizing China's economy and social structures and reforming its educational system. These reforms undermined the legitimacy of China's authoritarian Leninist system of government, which had been thoroughly corrupted by the explosive generation of wealth that flowed into the pockets of the ruling elite. This has caused the backlash, marked by repression of free thought and discussion, favoritism for state-owned enterprises, and emphasis to the point of absurdity on every aspect of life in China needing to have Chinese characteristics, an obvious effort to curb Western influences. This was not the intent of engagement, but it is one of its collateral consequences. China's communist rulers are struggling to manage the number one contradiction in China, which is that between its modernized economy and society and its refusal to modernize its pre-modern political systems. This goes back to my point at the beginning. All modern political systems are based on the concept that power corrupts and must be checked and balanced. China's political system refuses to accept this concept and prefers instead the total concentration of power in the hands of the Communist Party. There is a struggle underway in China to curb the influence of Western ideas and examples of governance. The repression in China is not necessarily the end state of where China is heading. It is part of the process of change. As Chairman Mao would have put it, to borrow from one of his more colorful quotes, you cannot expect China's authoritarian rulers to lay down their butcher's knives and become Buddhas. He said it about imperialists, but it can be equally applied to Chinese Communist Party rule in China. My point is that we should not prejudge the outcome of this struggle by analyzing developments in China over too short a time frame. The outcome will be determined over decades, not simply over a few short years. Just as globalization produced winners and losers in the United States, a problem that lies at the root of our domestic instabilities, it has had the same effect in China, privileging certain groups and arousing resentments in others. My second thought is that in our policy toward China, we should be focusing on achievable foreign policy goals, not on changing its domestic system. An all too familiar flaw in American strategic thinking is our tendency to define objectives that involve domestic changes in other countries that are beyond the reach of foreign policy or even military interventions to achieve. My rule of thumb for testing the validity of such thinking is to ask, why do we have unsavory regimes on our doorstep in the Western Hemisphere, whose domestic systems we have been unable to change for the better, despite, as in the case of Haiti, for example, repeated military interventions over the last century? Before we take on China, I would suggest that we use Cuba as a test case. Once we have changed it into a thriving democracy, we can apply the lessons learned from that process to remaking China. But until then, let's focus on setting foreign policy goals that don't involve nation building in Iraq, in Afghanistan, in China, or in other targets of opportunity. Experience shows that foreign policy cannot produce predictable changes within meaningful timeframes. Third, we should display more consciousness of the dangers of nuclear war. An all-out military conflict with China is as unthinkable as it was with the Soviet Union, because such a war would result in mutual destruction. We learned this lesson the hard way during the Cold War with the Soviet Union. The Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962 brought us to the brink of a nuclear conflict with the Soviet Union. Before that, both sides had focused on how to fight limited nuclear conflicts, believing that would be possible. After that, the emphasis shifted to how to avoid nuclear confrontations. With the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, we enjoyed the luxury of nearly 3 decades during which we did not need to think seriously about the dangers of nuclear war, because the Soviet threat no longer existed, and our relationship with China did not pose nuclear risks. This is no longer the case. However, when you read the policy recommendations in some of the essays being written about U.S. China relations, you can readily gain the sense that the lessons of the Cold War have been forgotten. Many analysts see possibilities for military confrontations between Washington and Beijing over Taiwan that could, if mishandled, escalate to the nuclear level. These risks need to be factored into our policy steps with respect to Taiwan. They are not being at the moment. Finally, we should not underestimate the difficulty of recovering from the damage to our international image and our soft power that has occurred over the last 4 years and even preceding that. The rise of China is confronting us with perhaps the biggest challenge in our history. We are engaged in a comprehensive competition with China in virtually every area. A brief look will reveal the nature of the challenge. China has licked the COVID-19 pandemic. The daily infection rate in China is minuscule in comparison with ours. Pockets of infection are immediately addressed and contained. Visitors to China report that life has returned to normal throughout the country. Mask wearing is no longer obligatory. Restaurants and theaters are packed to overflowing. China has developed its own vaccines and is distributing them to the world. Of the major economies in the world, only China's is projected to show positive growth last year. Companies such as Huawei have established strong footholds in providing the global telecommunications infrastructure of the future. Chinese infrastructure projects are springing up on every continent. We have nothing comparable. The United States is not a party to the two major trade agreements in East Asia: the Comprehensive and Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership, which we largely brought into being and then withdrew from, and the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership. China is a member of the latter and is considering joining the former. At the same time, China is increasingly reliant, as I noticed earlier, on repression to maintain domestic stability. Populations in Tibet and Xinjiang are restless. The one country, two systems concept is under systematic attack in Hong Kong from the mainland. Tensions in the Taiwan Strait are the highest in recent years. As this brief overview illustrates, our military competition with China is only one of the many areas in which China is challenging our traditional leadership. How well positioned are we to take on this challenge? The frank answer is not very well. Our country is deeply divided. These divisions will be displayed for all to see in the impeachment trial in another week, if it takes place. Trumpism was not repudiated in last November's presidential election. It has taken over the Republican Party, which is wrestling with how to handle that problem at this very moment. Last year, our economy was pummeled by the coronavirus, shrinking by 3.5%, the worst record in 75 years. The US unemployment rate last year reached 16%, the highest since 1948. It has come down substantially, but it is double where it was at the beginning of last year. Income disparities have worsened in a dramatic fashion. Unemployment is highest among workers and service personnel. In the meantime, the stock market is setting new records, with the Dow Jones soaring above 30,000. We have never seen such a disparity in the impact of an economic crisis on those better off and those struggling to pay their rent and feed their families. The top 10% of Americans in terms of income own 88% of the stock market. That leaves 12% for the next 40% of the highest income earners and nothing for the bottom 50%. So the well-off can sit at home and watch their stock holdings increase by millions, while others are struggling to find work and to pay their bills. The expectation is, again, that Biden will be a one-term president, with the possibility of the Trumpist Republicans returning to office in 4 years, preaching American first isolationism and indifference to trade and alliances. For the nearly 3/4 of a century since the end of World War II, America's friends and allies have been able to count on the United States as a country whose basic foreign policy orientation and intentions were reasonably consistent over time. This is no longer the case. My point is that we cannot simply assume that we can step back into a leadership role in the world. Other countries have lost the confidence they used to have in the staying power of the United States as a predictable international player. We have to regain that confidence, and I do not see enough attention devoted to that topic in the essays that I'm reading about our foreign policy challenges. My belief has always been that our systems and our values our favorable geographic circumstances, our affinities with powerful allies and friends, and our abundant human and natural resources well positioned us to outcompete a rising China without needing to demonize it or seeking to limit its rising standards of living. Those factors still work in our favor, but to a lesser degree than before. The United States and China have both changed significantly in recent decades, and the assumptions of the past will no longer serve us in the future. This is a giant problem for us because we want to recapture the role that we used to play. And in my judgment, the world has changed in ways that mean we must exercise our influence without thinking of ourselves as a leader that other countries, like-minded countries, will automatically follow. This conference hopefully will help us to address these new realities more effectively. As a guide, I would argue that we need look no further than Federalist Paper number 63, in which the presumed author, James Madison, offered the following advice. An attention to the judgment of other nations is important to every government for two reasons. The one is that independently of the merits of any particular plan or measure, it is desirable on various accounts that it should appear to other nations as the offspring of a wise and honorable policy. The second is that in doubtful cases, particularly where the national councils may be warped by some strong passion or momentary interest, the presumed or known opinion of the impartial world may be the best guide that can be followed. What has not America lost by her want of character with foreign nations? And how many errors and follies would she not have avoided if the justice and propriety of her measures had in every instance been previously tried by the light in which they would probably appear to the unbiased part of mankind? That phrase about needing to consider whether our particular plans or measures are seen by others as the offspring of a wise and honorable policy is a factor that, in my judgment, we have neglected in thinking about our role in the world. And I think that it would go far to restoring our leadership position if we gave more attention to the importance of adopting measures that are seen as the offspring of a wise and honorable policy. With those thoughts in mind, I look forward to the insights that will be offered by the Wilson Center Fellows and chewed over in our discussions over the next 2 days. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Ambassador Roy. Just very interesting and very important context for all of this. We have a little bit of time for Q&A. As I mentioned before, for those of you watching, if you would like to ask a question of Ambassador Roy, you can do so by emailing asia@wilsoncenter.org or tweeting us @Asia Program. So the first question, Ambassador Roy, comes from me. I'll take the moderator's prerogative. You may have seen that recently our new Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, made some remarks about China, including China's crackdown on Hong Kong, widely reported human rights abuses against Uyghur Muslims in Xinjiang, Taiwan, after which Yang Jiechi, chief of the Foreign Affairs Commission in Beijing, noted that the bilateral relationship was at a key moment, and said that the relationship needed to be restored to what he called a more predictable and constructive track. But he described issues like Taiwan, Hong Kong, Tibet, and Xinjiang, the issues that Blinken had just mentioned, as China's core interests in which the United States should stop interfering. And the quote from Yang Jiechi was, quote, "They constitute a red line that must not be crossed. Any trespassing would end up undermining China-US relations and the United States' own interests." So with the US looking to both enhance its ability to compete with China, but also looking for ways to cooperate in issues of mutual interest like climate change, and given your remarks on the United States not wanting to, or your belief that the United States should not interfere in issues that we can't have influence on in China's domestic affairs, how would you recommend to the current administration that the United States should handle issues such as Hong Kong, Tibet, Xinjiang, and even Taiwan?
That's a very big question, which is difficult to answer in a few minutes. Let me offer some brief comments, though, that address the issue that you raised. In my experience in diplomacy, the most important factor is not eloquence, but precision. In other words, you need to use words that accurately reflect both what you are trying to do and what you are criticizing. We live in an open world. Other countries are free to criticize how we handle our domestic affairs, and we are free to criticize how other governments handle their domestic affairs. I do not equate criticism with interference in the internal affairs of other countries, and that applies to Hong Kong and to Xinjiang. But members of this administration have claimed that genocide is taking place in Xinjiang. And I would argue that is the wrong language to use in discussing the abuses that are taking place there. There is much more evidence that China is not engaging in genocide in Xinjiang than that it is. This includes a major speech by President Jiang Zemin on the subject, in which he talked about the dangers of separatism, terrorism, and the difficulties of assimilation in Xinjiang. And he recommended ideas for trying to address this problem. And the re-education measures, used lightly, that China is undertaking in Xinjiang are addressing precisely those types of issues. But there's not a hint in that speech that China wanted to adopt genocidal measures. And if you look at the State Department's 2019, the latest one available, Human Rights Report on China, it does not refer to genocide taking place in Xinjiang. It does refer to lots of abuses that are taking place in Xinjiang, such as forced sterilizations, such as mysterious disappearances. But the report indicates that those same types of abuses are taking place throughout China. They are not only reserved for the Uyghur population of Xinjiang. So my point is that we are not using the precision necessary for good foreign policy in the ways that we are talking about China. We are leveling charges at China, which are not supportable by the available evidence. And this is not good foreign policy. There is much to criticize about China's behavior in Hong Kong and in Xinjiang. But we have to be careful in the words that we use. On the question of Taiwan, this administration has reaffirmed the three communiques. In the three communiques are the essence of the U.S. One China policy, which is that we can only recognize the legitimacy of one government in China, and that's reflected in the communiques where we recognize the government of the People's Republic of China as the sole legal government of China, and we affirm our intention to maintain unofficial relations with Taiwan. And to enable us to have robust unofficial relations with Taiwan, the Congress passed the Taiwan Relations Act, which also affirmed the fact that we would consider threats to Taiwan as disturbing the stability and peace of the Western Pacific and a subject that we would be deeply concerned about. It didn't specify exactly what we should do because it said we had to report to Congress and Congress would play a role in determining how we should respond. The question is, are we observing the ground rules for maintaining unofficial relations with Taiwan? This is what the mainland is concerned about. And a vital part of our commitment to this framework for dealing with both mainland China and Taiwan is we are deeply committed to a peaceful resolution of the question. Well, it is clear, and recent developments in mainland China have made it even clearer, that at the moment, prospects for a peaceful resolution of the Taiwan issue do not exist. But at the same time, the framework that we established at the time that we normalized relations with the People's Republic of China in 1979 has enabled Taiwan, without full recognition as an international entity, to thrive and prosper in ways that are far better than scores of independent countries. Taiwan now has a per capita GDP, which in many cases exceeds that of European countries. And throughout most of the last 50 some years, tensions in the Taiwan Strait have been low. Now tensions are creeping up and there is creeping officiality increasing in our relations with Taiwan. And these are undercutting prospects for maintaining the hope of an eventual peaceful resolution. So clearly, to deal with China, which has indicated it will use military force to prevent Taiwan from becoming an internationally recognized independent entity, that we have a stable status quo in the Taiwan Strait area that is consistent with our commitments in the 3 communiques. So this sets the limits on what we can do. And we are not doing it at the moment. We have had a non-stable status quo because there has been inching in the direction of greater officiality in our relations with Taiwan. So that's why I mentioned that we need to pay more attention to the problem of avoiding nuclear war, because the Taiwan issue is directly related to that. And what China is signaling to us in an increasingly forceful way is that there is a line that we cannot cross, and many in China think we have already crossed it. So in other words, this is the core issue in our ability to maintain peace and stability in East Asia, and Taiwan is an important factor. But the framework within which we need to address this question has enabled Taiwan to prosper in conditions of reasonable security, which is why Taiwan's defense budget is still at around 2% of GDP, which is a peacetime defense budget level. It's not a preparation for a potential military conflict. And we have to bear that in mind. So I think that this is an issue that the administration needs to give very serious attention to, because unless it signals that we will support a stable status quo in the Taiwan Strait area, the mainland will try to enforce that. And I think that Taiwan is much better off if we are the country that maintains the stability of the framework that we agreed to in 1979, as opposed to letting the mainland take on that responsibility. So this is a core issue in U.S. China relations, and the administration needs to think very seriously about how to handle that.
Very interesting. We got about 10 minutes left. I wanted to ask a follow-on question as it relates to, you mentioned a few times the prospect of conflict and nuclear exchange in our relationship with China, which is not an issue that gets a lot of attention. Now, the U.S. has been trying to engage with China on these issues, on issues of nuclear weapons, arms control, those sort of dialogues. Like, we have a very rich infrastructure of dialogues and engagements with Russia over the decades on these issues. But so far, over the last 15 years or so, despite U.S. efforts to do so, Beijing has been reluctant to have those discussions. So I'm curious, Ambassador Roy, if you could talk a bit about your sense of what we could do to be able to actually talk about these issues with Beijing, and what, if any, impediments do you believe need to be removed in order to actually have those discussions?
That's a terrific question, Abe, and it's one that I hope gets some attention in our discussions over the next 2 days. This is related to the real challenge we have with China, which is, can we have a stable relationship, or is it going to constantly move us closer to a potentially catastrophic conflict between us? You're absolutely right. China in the past has been reluctant to engage with us on arms control measures at all. And when I first visited China in 1976 with the House Armed Services Committee, this is before we had diplomatic relations, we met with the PLA, and members of the congressional delegation tried to engage them on these types of issues. And they asked, for example, what measures did China have to deal with the problem of accidental launch? It turned out no one on the PLA side understood the concept. They said, we don't accidentally launch our missiles. That was the issue. Well, China is now much more sophisticated in terms of its understanding of the concepts of arms control. But they feel that they have had a minimal deterrent against the United States, and that we will try to exploit that by dragging them into negotiations involving the two major nuclear powers of the world, which are the United States and Russia now. But they are going to have to engage sooner or later in those discussions. Because the problem at the moment is China is claiming the right to have a world-class military by the middle of the century without relating this to China's defense needs. So in a sense, China is ignoring the security dilemma, even though President Xi Jinping in some of his speeches has explicitly referred to it by saying that if China has absolute security, its neighbors will not have security. But in the way that China is defining its defense requirements, they are no longer related simply to defense, but to status. China is demanding the right to have a military that reflects China's role as a great power, not in terms of its defense requirements and its responsibilities for the defense of others. Because the United States has to size our military, not simply in terms of defending us, but we have to also come to the defense of our allies in crises. So the question is, if we are defining our defense requirements in terms of maintaining superiority, and China is defining its defense requirements in terms of having a world-class military equivalent to ours, there's a contradiction. And if the contradiction is not addressed in our policy approach, we will end up in an endless arms race, because each side will be setting goals that the other considers unacceptable. This issue has not been seriously addressed because until now, the United States has not been prepared to recognize that we need a military balance with China as opposed to superiority over China. And China has not been willing to address it either because it has felt it was too weak to do so. I would argue that China is no longer too weak to be able to use that as a justification for not addressing the issue of, is there a military balance in the Western Pacific that can enable each of us to feel that we can meet our defense requirements? And in our case, that means defense of our allies as well as our own defense interests. But that China can also feel it can defend itself against potential threats. I think there is middle ground there, but we have to find it. And at the moment, that's not part of our policy approach. So I think that you've put your finger on an issue that needs to be addressed by both sides in order to assure a more secure Asia-Pacific region over coming decades.
Great. Thank you so much, Ambassador Roy. We are just about out of time. Stephen, Ambassador Roy, I don't know if you have any final comments, things you wanted to make to close out our keynote session.
Well, I looked through the entire schedule and I find that every one of the topics is of great interest to me. So I'm really looking forward to getting started with the program.
As am I. Stephen, anything to
I
close out with?
concur.
Okay, so you can all join us later today. Our first panel, entitled "The Chinese Authoritarian Model and Its Global Impact," will be held at 12:30 p.m. Today, Eastern Time. It will be moderated by my colleague, Charles Krause, who's Deputy Director of the History and Public Policy Program, and it'll feature Sheena Greetens, Darren Byler, and Alex Dukalskis, three of our great China fellows. And it's going to be at the same place. You can watch this. You can watch that session at the same place you've watched this one. So please join us then as our fellows explore the China model and its global impact. Until then, we'll see you later. Thank you all very much.
Thank you.